Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the ego. What is the ego? Well, everybody might interpret this differently, and I don't really expect anybody to agree with me. These are just my opinions, my points of view, and as we saw in other videos that I've made, it's just an opinion. I think that only you have the power to discover for yourself what your ego is for you. But I can say, from my point of view, for me personally, I believe that my ego is the voice in that mind that talks to me non-stop from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed. For me, the ego is the voice of desires. It's the voice of wants, false needs. It's the voice of every single kind of emotion that I can possibly humanly generate. For me again, it's the selfish motivating element behind all of the actions we carry out in life. I think the ego is very much motivated by selfishness. I think it's the part of us that only thinks about us, only thinks about how we feel, what we want. I think it's linked to our temporary and immediate gratification because it doesn't think about the long-term happiness, not for us, not for anybody else. In fact, I think the ego is that part of us that doesn't really take anybody else into consideration whatsoever, because for the ego there is only me, myself and I. That's what the ego is. It's very much focused on the pleasure senses of the here and the now. It's kind of the voice that says, well, I want this now and stuff the consequences kind of thing. Furthermore, I believe that the ego is what is responsible for creating everything in the world around us. It creates our own world. I think that everything, well, like I said before, every desire is the product of the ego. And I think that when we hold on to our ego, when we have an attachment to our ego, it's actually impossible to be happy, because every desire we have is the product of our ego. And every time we satisfy that desire, the ego grows a bit more. It thinks it can get away with it because it has got away with it, because we are willing to satisfy every single desire we have through it. And so therefore it grows and it grows and it grows, and the more it grows, the more it demands, and the more it demands, we just get into this perpetual cycle of wanting, and then we go on a painful journey of satisfying, and then once we've satisfied, boom, the ego comes up with something else. This, for me personally, this is what I consider the perpetual cyclic existence of samsara. This continuous going around and around in circles of demands and wants and finding a way to satisfy those desires, and then the ego coming up with more, and we just get caught in this, what I can only explain as a rat race, if you like, to satisfy the demands, consistent and persistent, because the ego never stops. The ego wants and wants and wants. It just doesn't stop until we find a way of controlling it and silencing it. And we can only do that when we come from a place of who we truly are. And yes, like I said, I kind of associate this with the perpetual cyclic existence in samsara that Buddhism talks about, because we just get caught up in this continuous cycle where it's impossible almost to satisfy our desires. And because it's impossible to satisfy all these desires, and because the ego demands more and more and more, we fall into this place of unhappiness, or only temporary happiness, which is not rewarding in any way. It's kind of, again, it comes back to that instant gratification. We're happy for the moment. We're happy when we've achieved what we need to achieve, to keep the ego happy for the time it's happy until it can come up with a fresh desire for us to go chasing after. Now, on the flip side of the coin, I believe very strongly that the more we understand the ego, the closer we come to accepting responsibility for how it creates this environment and this cyclic rhythm that we find ourselves in. And I think the more we accept responsibility for that is the day that we begin to control our ego. And I think that when we give our ego the loving compassion and show it the kindness that we would show other people, then I think we bring the ego more into silence. And when we bring the ego into silence, that's when we stop wanting, stop desiring, and just be. That's when we are, and that's when we begin to interact with the world in a completely different way. Once we find that we don't have these desires and these wants, we're free to be happy because we're not made slaves of our desires. We exist in simplicity. We see the beauty in the small things. We appreciate life from a different point of view. We appreciate existence itself from a very different point of view, because that's when we become connected to existence itself. And once we become connected to this existence, we find that there is nothing else other than energy. We live from a place that, if we want to bring it into the dualistic world we live in, then we live in a place that is based in our heart. It's heart-centered and not mind-centered. And once we live from the place in our hearts, we're constantly happy. We find happiness in everything, in anything. We're no longer selfish. We think about others more than we think about ourselves, because our main aim is to spread this happiness that we've found to other people so that they can understand it. It's also very much my personal belief that when we do finally silence our ego, apart from not wanting for anything, we also accept responsibility for every way we interact in the world and for every way that we interact with other people in the world. The happiness of others becomes our happiness. And the only way we prolong this happiness and live in this perpetual state of happiness is by realizing that we're not alone and that we are all interconnected. And that every thought we have, every action we take has an impact on somebody somewhere. And I think that's when we really begin to start living as the authentic selves that we are. Okay, that's it for today. Next time we'll be talking about how we can silence the ego and how the ego works. Thank you very much. Have a magnificent day, and don't forget to subscribe and share if you find anything of interest in what I have to say. Again, just remember though, it's only my opinion. You have to find out your own truth.